Welcome back to the Heroes Forge. Today, we are going to be reacting to some content by Malcolm and Simone Collins, where they are talking about marriage models and how sometimes tradcons get things really incorrect about what traditional labor framing looked like between men and women back in the day. So, we're going to go ahead and take a look at that right over here and add this to stage. And let's do proper YouTube stuff, get them maximized. No, this isn't the right video. We're going to go to this video. We're going to open it up.
Side of a car. Okay.
Hold up. Let's go ahead and make sure that we got things nice and framed up properly. There we go. And here
you see somebody with a 60-pound jug of something on their head.
Oh, it's a woman, obviously. Yeah.
Always a woman.
Always a woman.
You go to Africa, you'll see this as well. You go
China too. Let's be clear. China too.
Yeah. Was it majority women doing the harder labor when you're talking? Yeah. Guys, you do not know how brain cucked you are if a woman has convinced you, we just need to go back to the traditional way and I'll stay at home and you do all this stuff. Because you're so strong. Look at your muscles. Could you open this jar for me? Oh, you see, as a woman, I could just never do anything.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. Today I'm going to talk.
Can barely hear the video. Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and see if I can up the volume right quick. Because it's inputting on my volume frequency. Let's try this.
About the most diabolical brainwashing mind trick that feminists and women have ever pulled on males in human society. And it is that I will hear dyed-in-the-wool males who identify as misogynist, red pill, post-pickup artists, trads, go out there and say, well, we need to go back to the way things used to be, where women didn't work and stayed in the household and just cared for kids. And I see their wives behind their fans with their villainous faces going,
oh my God.
Their villainous laugh. That they have completely cucked their husbands' brains. And their husbands believe that historically, women didn't work.
We must let
misogynists
think this was his idea. All right, that he came up with. All right, now he's gonna figure it out. All right, okay, I know what to do.
All right, this is from the Big Fat Greek Wedding, and they're going to go ahead and try to convince this guy by making something look like his own idea. So, bottom line, what Malcolm and Simone Collins are doing is they're looking at historical arrangements between men and women to see who would do what labor back in the day, because a lot of times people that are traditionally conservative will take a look at the modern time, and they'll take a look at like the 1950s and use that as the proper model for what things should be, with women kicking up their feet and just watching the kids at home and educating them, and then that's it. Whereas historically speaking, so back before 1910, when men would go ahead and earn individual wages, that families were organized completely differently. So let's continue and look up.
You don't know what to do. You talk. Do you want my
Yes, I want your
Vula, how is business? Oh, woe to me.
my weak constitution, my weak mind. As a woman, I am simply not fit for it.
Business is bad.
What's the matter? What's happened? She suffers?
She suffers. She has to be at the travel agency alone all day.
While her kids are at home.
That's right.
So?
Take the kids with you to work.
You'll be with Tucky.
That would be good. That would be no good.
No good.
No good. No good. Because,
When a woman has her kids around, she just can't focus.
and that's why that no work.
I have your answer.
I will do all the work for you, and you stay home all day with the kids.
Oh, I can't believe that. Wonderful.
Oh,
Wonderful.
So they went ahead and put the idea in his mind, basically, for the thing that they actually wanted him to come to himself, and started treating him as if he had come up with the idea himself, and praised him for coming up with the idea that they've already planted in his mind. That's the idea here.
Man.
and I saw this in the comments again recently, where like even
Oh, really?
in this video, guys were like, well, women held some roles historically outside the house, but you know, they weren't like cobblers, and they weren't like sailors, and they weren't like, you know, stonemasons. And it's like all of that is true.
Yeah.
However, the way that all of those businesses were managed, where if a guy was a stonemason or a cobbler or anything like that, his books and his inventory sourcing and his client sourcing generally would have been handled by the woman. But it wasn't even just that. It was, if you actually look at the statistics around female labor in history, women actually did, if you're talking about hard labor, the labor that fed the family, right? Women actually did the majority of the work over the vast majority of human history. If you go back to, let's say, hunter-gatherer society, for example, because we've been able to study this in great detail, women produced, in terms of daily caloric intake, between 80 and 60% of the calories that the family ate.
So that's something that flies in the face of a lot of people, traditional conservatives nowadays, is they don't go ahead and look back further in time to a different time where families would orient themselves differently based on what each of the people in the marriage were better suited to. So women were generally better suited to laborious tasks that required endurance over an extended period of time, whereas men were better suited to things that were higher risk and higher reward. So things like actually taking up the skill of becoming an artisan. It takes so many hours to actually produce the good, whereas the wife oftentimes would be dealing with the marketing, getting the raw goods that he needed to produce the artisan goods to begin with. All of those things were typically handled by the woman in the relationship, whereas the man would push forward and do the things that were higher risk. Interesting. Let's continue.
Oh my gosh, really?
This is 95%
Wow.
of human history.
Well, this, you know, this also makes sense in other things where you see sexual dimorphism. For example, women being having much higher endurance and pain tolerance versus men who are better like sprinters.
Yeah.
Or to word it another way, the female body and psychology at an evolutionary level are optimized for grueling labor, while the male body and mind are optimized for warfare and disposability. Neither are totally optimal, but the idea that women are beautiful flowers designed to sit inside all day caring for children far from any risk of manual labor is probably the greatest feminist psyops of all time and completely ahistoric.
And yeah, that really implies millions of years of higher workloads.
And this is actually even true. And we're going to talk about like why this is the case. Because note, people can be like, but this just makes no sense. I thought women, because they're the weaker, they must do less work. And it's like, bitch, have you ever seen how lions make this shit work?
Dude, he is so right on the money. Like lions, they will just lay around and let the lionesses do all the work. And then when it comes time to defend the pride, that's when he gets up and handles business. Every other time, it is the lionesses that are doing the work. So this is an interesting distribution of labor in lion society.
A male lion sits around all day and the females bring him food because that's the way human society is supposed to work.
Oh, God.
And if you go back to the most trad iterations of human society, let's go with the ultra-Orthodox Jews, okay? In ultra-Orthodox Jewish society, do men work? No.
Oh, God.
Men don't work. Women work. Men spend all day studying. You actually see this in
Studying.
if you go to more primitive iterations of Islamic society. I remember this in Morocco.
Dude, they're not kidding. Like that's actually how it's oriented, where the women would go ahead and do the work, and then he would spend his time working himself in a spiritual sense. So that was how they oriented themselves in those societies.
You're out in the desert.
Okay.
And we met, you know, a traditionalist Muslim.
Oh, yes.
group.
Yes.
And the men did not work. That was considered like very offensive. Even the idea that a man would have a job. That is, of course, the purview of women to have jobs. And you could say, well, Malcolm, surely you don't want us to be like those those Muslims or those Jews. And I'm like, well, actually, even if you go back to early European society, most farming through most of human history was done by women. People are like, what? I thought men handled farming. And it's like,
yeah, that men handled farming once it became more efficient to do so. So the invention of the plow went ahead and changed that. And it required manual strength that men could provide that women could not. But one man could go ahead and plow entire fields in ways that it took a community of women to do the same thing. So technological advancement is what caused men to do that. But it was fewer men that were actually doing it. Pretty interesting stuff.
actually, men only moved to handle the majority of farming after one particular invention. Do you know what it was?
What was it called? I want to say spinning jenny because it's just the first thing that comes to mind.
Plow.
But the plow. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, in regions where the plow is not used due to soil conditions and stuff like that,
Yeah.
the majority of farming is typically done by women.
Huh.
In Europe, before the introduction of the plow, which happened 1000 AD, so pretty recently, the majority of farming was done by women, unless you were having slaves do it or something like that. But even when you were having slaves do it and you had a big estate, the majority of the family's work was still done by women because they managed the family's household and finances.
So to Phantasma's point, you're absolutely right. So early farming, for the most part of human history, was done in communities. And so you would have communities of women doing a lot of the heavy work associated with the farming. And then you'd have other women that were either pregnant or giving birth, and then they would go ahead and watch over the kids while the other women would take care of things. So they would divide up the labor that way. Let's continue.
Which we will get to. And so if you're like, wait, okay, if women were doing the majority of actual work throughout human history in terms of calorie acquisition, in terms of financial management, what were men doing? What was the male role in human history? Why were women okay taking on this role that seems to be, because imagine, and this is why I'm saying that it's such a cuck thing to not know this, is that you're literally going out there when the truth of human history is women both manage child rearing and manage calorie acquisition, okay? And you're going out there and saying, no, I'll do the trad thing and just do all of the labor, and women can do a quarter of what women ever did historically. But sorry, I cannot get over, because we're going to go over to how.
So it's really important to be able to separate out. So this dynamic only really stopped starting in 1910 when individual wages became a ubiquitous function of society in the industrial age. So in the agrarian age, in the Bronze Age, and in times past, you would have direct farm to market and you'd have direct artisan to market kind of relationships, where in an industrialized society, you typically have middlemen that help smooth out those supply chains substantially. And that did not exist back then. So let's continue.
Somehow women psyopsed men into believing this. We're going to go over traditional marriage structures, how they developed that way, because you were aware of this when we were talking about this, but I just think a lot of guys, they have this cargo cult of trad, where they have this vision in their head of what a hunter-gatherer society was like. They have this vision in their head of what early medieval life was like, and it allows them to define themselves, because if they have this idea of this is what men did back then and this is what women did back then, that means that, well, if they just emulate this role that they believe is a prehistoric role of what a man is, well, now it's fed into their identity. I am man does X. Okay, so
that is so true. So a lot of guys will go ahead and take on this traditional mindset as a matter of identity. And so they believe that because it existed for a period of time and they don't know the history going back, that they don't know what a properly ordered family looked like for most of human history, and then how to apply it in the modern context so that we can go ahead and well establish families today. So there's something like that. And let's go ahead and we'll speed this up because I think that we can go ahead and listen to this at 1.25 speed and still keep up. All right, let's continue.
What did man actually do historically? Like, what was the man's actual role in a family? The man's actual role in a family, and I've talked about this as a way to model your relationships, and increasingly I'm realizing that when I go out there and I can say, here's an optional way to model your relationship, I've increasingly realized I need to stop saying that. People are too stupid, and then they just model their relationships in stupid ways. The ideal way to model your relationship is in what we call a sword and shield relationship.
Yeah.
That means the woman is in charge of making sure the daily caloric needs of the family are met and that you don't lose all your assets. And this is what women mostly did on a historic basis. The man is in charge of moving the family's status upwards, which means that he's in charge of high risk, high reward opportunities. Obviously, if you're only familiar with stereotypes in history, the two examples of this that are going to come to mind immediately are going to be Viking society, where the women would manage the farms and the men would go a Viking, and the men would go on these raids to try to get lots of treasure to raise the family status, right? Another example would be Spartan society, where women would manage the helots and they managed the farm, and the men would go out and perform their military duties, and they'd come back and they might, acquire stuff. You also had this in Roman society where men would go out. Now less so because Roman took from Greek society, and Greek society is one of the few societies where women actually almost did no actual work.
Cool. So let's go ahead and hit on this idea that they're putting forward, the idea of a sword and a shield kind of relationship, where the women would go ahead and handle things like managing finances, managing calorie acquisition, and making sure that the family was fed. Things that were stable and administrative in nature were their primary roles in these kinds of relationships and societies. So if we go ahead and look at, say, the Proverbs 31 woman, for those of you who are Christians and familiar, Proverbs 31 is often something that's bandied about as the idealized woman. And so in that story, she is getting up early, making sure that everybody is fed. She is overseeing the household duties and responsibilities while her husband is governing at the city gate. So it is an aristocrat family, and he is handling business and elevating status and doing the acts of rulership, whereas she is doing the acts of administration at the estate at home. So that's how it works in a couple of different contexts. In my own context, this is basically how my wife and I have structured our marriage. So she stays at home, she takes care of the kids, she educates them. She doesn't do the financial administration, but she does do all the grocery shopping, all of the basic needs and resource acquisition kinds of things. And I go ahead and provide her vision and direction as far as what I see. And then my responsibility is to push the family forward in terms of status acquisition, in terms of wealth building and things of that nature. So I do the things that are a lot more stress inducing because they are volatile in nature, whereas my wife handles things that are more routine in nature. And that's how we have divided up the labor in our household. And then let's see, Ozzy. Yeah, they've got these old styles of glasses. I think it's pretty fun. I like these people a lot. They have a lot of great takes. And then, yes, they have a cute baby. They have a lot of kids and they want to have more. So I'm on board with it. I've got 4 kids. I get it. I get the idea. Let's continue.
Hid in the back of the house.
Yeah, one of the very few societies in human history where women were actually basically just locked inside 24/7.
Yeah.
Now, one of the places, if you want to look into research on this, and I think that she actually significantly understates this, was the Nobel Prize winning research by Claudia Godlin, who showed the U-shaped pattern in female labor, which shows basically what we said before, is that around, and I think that she actually gets some of her numbers wrong, but she tries to look at historical.
Actually, I went back over her actual data, and her work is clearly misstated. If you're only familiar with the little cartoon she has of female labor, you'd get this impression that female labor started to die out in like the 1850s and then bottomed out in the 1910s and was never really significantly higher than male labor participation. But if you actually look at her data, you can see that this is nowhere near true. Also, just a funny side note here. Have you noticed that her most modern woman is wearing a hijab? Just so you know where she wants society going. But yeah, this cartoon that you may have seen of her work doesn't align with her actual data, but the actual data show.
Let's actually take a look at this. So our agriculture, we're taking a look at the fact that she was doing a lot of the farming while the kids were nearby. And then, hey, she's still doing a lot of the heavy labor. And then before the true industrial age, she was manning the loom and things of that nature to make textiles, which was labor and time intensive. And then down in here, where there was still household management. And then it bottoms out around 1910, around the proliferation of wage grade jobs for men at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and proliferating out from there. And then there's changes in expectations here in the 60s or late 60s, early 70s. We got contraception, and we got the rise of feminism, and now we've got girl bosses. So let's go ahead and continue.
Which I think even she is afraid men will look at history and realize they shouldn't be saying, hey, woman, get in the kitchen and make me a sandwich. It's, hey, woman, get in the field and cultivate me a sandwich.
Whatever. But around 1910 is when, or let's say the 1900s is when male wage labor really began to pick up in Indian society. The idea that a man would leave the household. And this is when things began to fall apart. Because remember how I said, like,
yes.
as society developed, right? Okay, well, now you've got the plow, now you've got specialization, now you don't have a woman gathering, now you don't have a woman on the farm, you have a woman managing the books and the supply chain and the sales and the managing the storefront, right? Like the classic example I give is, okay, you have a cobbler or you have a butcher or something like that. So the guy learns the skill. He learns how to cobble, he learns how to make the shoes, he learns how to handle the wrapping of it and everything like that. Very complicated. And the woman manages what women are disproportionately good at, which is interpersonal skills and bureaucracy. And so she manages the sitting behind the counter, taking the money, marketing the product, managing sort of guild bureaucratic stuff, managing the finances. Basically, women did a sort of middle management job. And as males, and this would be true like with whatever the profession was, whether you were a cobbler or whether you were a butcher or something like that, like why wouldn't, like, you got to understand, men during this period didn't have this idea of masculinity that you had, right? They had an idea of masculinity, but if you went to them or their wives and you said something like, actually, the husband needs to manage all of this other stuff, right? Both the wife and the husband would be like, but why? Like,
all right, let's think through that real quick. So if the guy has got to go ahead and make for the cobbler example, he's got to make the shoes. So he needs to have all the techniques down. He needs to be able to make shoes from raw materials. Why is he going to go ahead and spend any less time doing that when he has a perfectly capable wife that can go ahead and sell the shoes, market the shoes, deal with the guild relationships so that he could focus on actually making the shoes? Because the shoes are what was generating the income for the family. All of the support functions around delivering the shoes to the marketplace and getting the shoes sold were handled by the wife in that relationship, whereas the husband was the one manufacturing the shoes. Now, this would be the case up until the time that you had factory industry and things of that nature, and guys would leave the household in order to work. We're talking about a situation pre-industrialization and where you had households that were doing their thing as the main source of income for their family. Let's continue.
the husband is focused on the specialized skill that he needs to continue to improve so that our family can make money. I, the woman, have free time on my hands. Why would I not be managing the things that allow my husband to focus on his specialty skill?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it would come off as like completely insane that the husband would waste time that they could have cobbling or butchering or whatever their actual skill was to manage the shop, to manage the sales process, to manage the, it just would come across as like, are you just telling me to like waste money? Like, there are kids, like, we're making this money for our family and our kids, because remember, historically, Simone wouldn't become Simone Collins, she'd become Mrs. Malcolm Collins, right? Like, people really had a combined identity. This idea of
this is how my wife signs off on her emails, and in her correspondence, she signs Mrs. Michael Richter, because we have a combined identity of what the deal is. This is great. So once again, looking at this as a combined identity, because each person specializes in their part, we can see this in a modern context a little bit when a guy starts up something like a handyman service or something like that. Anytime he is doing phone calls or any kind of customer service or any relatively low leverage task, that is a task of him not being able to get more jobs and not being able to actually do the work that generates the income in the first place. So you'll see a lot of people will orient this as husband and wife teams, where the guy does the work, he has the skill, he goes and does the jobs and sells the contracts, whereas the wife will go ahead and handle the administrative matters, the bookkeeping, things of that nature, customer relations, these kinds of things. And eventually, as you grow, the husband ends up hiring on a secretary or a front of office staff and then builds out from there. And then the wife ends up getting retired out of that position and maybe really more focuses on marketing or something else until that function gets taken over. And then she can go ahead and do something else for the maintenance of the family.
The woman's needs versus the man's needs.
I wish we could bring that back, by the way, that you had to address someone by like their combined partner name going forward.
Yeah. Well, because you were one entity afterwards.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense. It's like,
So in formal society, it is very common for the wife to be addressed as Mrs. Richter in my wife's case, right? Rather than by her first name. It is very common until someone invites you to call them something different, that the default term is the husband's last name, Mrs. last name, and that's it. And just like Green Garbador brings up, you're absolutely right. It is never the case where the guy is introduced as her name. This has been the case for society writ large and will continue to be this case, especially because we know that at the higher levels and at the lowest levels that this whole feminism thing doesn't go ahead and seep into the brains of most people. It's just a lot of people in the middle that are just like dealing with this hot nonsense. Let's continue.
idea of males and females having competing needs is a modern concept that was created by the atomization of the family.
Yeah.
But anyway, so women had these sorts of roles, and then men, and keep in mind, these sorts of roles were roles that women were relegated into after all of the domains that women used to specialize in were taken away from them.
Yeah.
Like in farming, the reason why women stopped being the majority of farming labor after the invention of the plow is the plow required more brute strengths.
Mhm.
So men were able to take it over. But also keep in mind, in a society historically, if you can be like, okay, but then why would society structure themselves this way? Like, why would societies have women be the majority calorie income generators, right? Like, what the heck were men doing if women were doing this, right? So if they were not out doing the high risk, high reward thing, why were men doing high risk, high reward martial adjacent activities? It was because women suck at war, okay?
We're really not good at it. Yeah.
That is so true. And like Andrew Wilson goes ahead and talks about force doctrine as a primary reason why rights are afforded to people through men, because men are the only ones that are capable of actually defending rights. Let's continue.
That's what men were training on. And this also comes to hunter-gatherer societies. So in hunter-gatherer societies, and again, the manosphere always freaks out about this because they don't actually read the research. Leftists will say things like, well, actually, when you look at large studies like Andreessen et al. 2023, women hunted in 79% to 63% of foraging societies. Yes,
that may be true, but what are they hunting? Are they hunting the woolly mammoths? No, they're not doing that. Let's go ahead and continue.
This is hunter-gatherer societies. And so they're like, of course, women wouldn't go on a mammoth hunt. And it's like, yeah, that's true. What were women hunting in these societies? Okay, because they weren't hunting what men were hunting in these societies. Men were hunting things that would prepare them for war, were allegories for war, because you had to defend your territory. This is why the male lion lazes about all day, okay? What women were hunting were things like squirrels and bunnies and mice. They were hunting a completely different type of game. It was
low stakes. Yeah.
Yeah, low stakes,
low risk, low reward. Yeah.
Yeah, but today as a guy, you're so like dichotomous, which is one of the things we try to break people out of on this channel. Like, well, there's hunting and there's gathering. And the moment you hear, oh, when a leftist says females were participating in 79% of the hunt, like that they hunted meat in 79% of hunter-gatherer societies, why would women arbitrarily not hunt bunnies when they saw a bunny, right? Like when they're foraging? Why would they opportunistically not make little traps for shrews and mice and stuff like that that might be around the campsite, right? Mm-hmm. Why would they like just to arbitrarily be like, no, only men can touch meat? That's a weird way to just sort of cut to our society, right? Like it makes no sense. And when you think about it a little bit, you're like, oh yeah, that would make sense. A society where they demanded that men be the primary calorie getters, right? And women just stay at home all day. Well, those men don't have as much time to train for war anymore, right? And if they don't have as much time to train for war, well, what happens to those men in the long term? They and their way of life get eradicated.
Right. So they lose wars, and then all of a sudden the women get taken over and become war brides. That's just what happens. It's a dirty part of history, but that's just what it is. So you want to go ahead and make sure that men are fighting fit and ready to go just in case somebody comes to invade. And that's how they organize societies, because when it was needed, you wanted men to be strong and lethal at a moment's notice. That's just what it was.
So what about the societies where you don't see this in a historic context? Like, let's look at ancient Athens, right? Which is an actual historic counterexample. And we'll go through other historic examples here. But okay, so Athenian men, because they did not have women managing trade and finance and everything like that, they managed it themselves, right?
Yeah.
But that meant that they didn't have time to learn how to war. So how did Athenian men fight?
Oh my God, this is why we have democracy. This is why.
Yes, they fought with the lower castes and essentially slave labor. That is what powered the triremes that maintained the Athenian naval hegemony. Is incredibly, and as Simone was joking, this is where we get early votes being widely distributed, because if you have trireme members who are otherwise pretty low caste, and you could say, well, now you get to vote, right? Well, you get to vote on which high caste person you want to
Because no vote. I'll tell you what.
yeah, no
you gotta
vote,
do
no
it.
vote. But that's where that came from, right? Is that the Athenian male sort of citizen, they it's not that they never fought. Like you do see Athenians fight in history, but they leaned really hard on the lower castes in a way that other societies like Spartans and Thebes simply didn't.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because at basically the beginning of what we would consider Western society, so Greece and Romans and things of that nature, they would go ahead and fight with slave labor and people in the lower castes. And it was interesting because that was one of the most common ways, aside from merchanting, to escalate your status in the world. That's how grueling it was back in the day for you to go ahead and climb the social hierarchy. It was very difficult, and very few men could do it. Whereas today, you just go ahead and learn to be a gentleman, you make a lot of money, you learn a good skill, and then you can climb the social hierarchy much easier in one generation than you could in ages past. And so the people that would climb up the social hierarchy from the lower classes often did so because of valor that they performed while they were in warfare. Very different. Let's continue.
To continue here, let's go with we've already gone over Vikings. I assume people are pretty familiar with Viking labor division, but let's look at medieval Europe. 13.
I always crack up though with that. What was that comedic Viking show where like there was one woman who would go raiding?
Yeah,
and
the
her
raping
husband
one.
stayed home. Well, I mean, they're like, well, of course she rapes and pillages and everything, just like all the other ones. And then like her husband's getting increasingly uncomfortable.
You're really proud of your wife, at least? I mean, Freya dove into that pillaging 100%. Even took part in quite a lot of the raping.
Yeah. I don't think that happened very much. Yeah, and in terms of like female sailors, there was that one famous female pirate who like masqueraded as a man and developed this ingenious way to urinate without showing that she was a woman. But yeah, tough times.
Anyway, so in medieval Europe, the farmland was a joint production unit, but tasks were sharply gendered along lines based on physical demands, risk, and compatibility with childcare. Men handled higher risk, strength-intensive field work, plowing with oxen. So this is after the plow, by the way, is what I'm going over here. Mowing and threshing grain. Women focused on lower risk, more reliable tasks that could be multitasked near young children, gleaning leftover grain for the harvest, clearing weeds, binding sheaves, making hay, collecting wood, and sheep shearing. Harvesting itself was often shared. Women also managed garden, livestock, dairy, poultry, and most crucially dominated textile production, spinning and weaving, which formed the backbone of both household needs and export industry. They produced cloth, ale, cheese, and other goods for home use or local sale. So it's important.
So they would still do a lot of the manual labor. They would just do so in a way that made it conducive for them to still watch over the children and do the labor at the same time, because they were away from the dangerous tasks that required a lot more strength and a lot more just raw muscle than the men did. That's just one of those things. It's a very different dynamic. But it doesn't mean that it could not be mirrored in a similar way in modern times. Let's continue.
If you were a farming family, of the stuff you sold, the majority of it was produced by women.
Yeah.
These are your cheeses. People don't realize how important cheese was as an export product. It was so important that in medieval Scotland, you would pay your taxes in cheese. Like it was just like, this is the easily durable. And I can just imagine the king's cellar full of cheeses, right? Like,
yeah, it's the chocolate of Europe. Before.
Yeah.
Chocolate.
So they would produce that. They would produce the cloth, which was also an easy export product. They would produce your textiles, which was an easy export product. Men were not producing these things. And keep in mind, this is post-plow.
Yeah.
This is post-women no longer doing the majority of farming.
Yeah, so this is, you would argue, artificially depressed.
Yeah, this is women at like one of their low points in human history, one of their low regions in human history, still doing a great deal of the labor.
Totally.
This idea, again, do not allow yourself to be cut into this belief that women just did childcare and education. They did not. They did the majority of what we would today call labor. Men did speculative ventures, which is very different from like just labor. And note, they were not building because people were like, well, were they out there building architecture and new houses and stuff like that? It's like, no, because that is more in the category of speculative venture. To do something like that, what do you need to do? You typically need some form of loan, some sort of existing business supply. These are building a building is a high risk, high reward thing.
Yes.
If you have never done this, if you have never built a house or been responsible for any kind of construction, it is highly speculative. And if you don't know what you're doing, you could go ahead and lose your shirt real easily and get yourself, up over your head with loans and things of that nature. It is crazy. So of course, men were doing these things that were more speculative and more high risk, high reward in nature, whereas women would do things that were relatively low risk and safe and consistent, things that you can program for. Whereas men would deal with things that were more variable and would have more risk involved with it.
A wagon historically was very expensive. That's a
Oh, yeah.
high risk, high reward thing, okay? That requires some level of artisanal expertise. Those were what men did historically. But
Yep.
keeping the family alive is what women did historically. And I'll note here, I repeatedly see families think they're doing something like new and progressive and converge back on this. They're like, oh yeah, the wife is like the nurse or the stable job that makes a decent income.
Yeah.
And the husband is the entrepreneur.
Yes.
This is I'd almost say it's like the normal structure among most of our friends in relationships.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Wife has like a W-2 steady job. Husband does something.
Watch out for nurses, gentlemen. One of the highest professions of adultery is nursing. So just watch out for that.
Risky for sure.
Yeah. As historian Jane Whittle noted, by the way, drawing on coroner rolls, women's accidental deaths were overwhelmingly domestic or village-based, 61%. Now, I would note that what's really interesting there is you can say, oh, that's huge. Women only died within the village at 61% of the time. Now, keep in mind what that means. 49% of women were dying outside of the village. Why were women, if women were like these shut-ins during the medieval period, 1300 to 1500,
Yeah.
and this is
He means 39%. So, 61 minus 100 is 39. That's the difference. That's okay. It gets the point across. We still know what he's talking about. Let's continue.
Jane Whittle's work. Why were so many of them outside of the village?
Well, these are
Why were-
specifically though, they're accidental deaths. So that's unusual too.
Well, right, but this means you're putting yourself at risk when you go outside the village. No matter
Sure.
what, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Doing these sorts of. I'm just pointing out that like this happened. Now let's go to urban settings. Oh, and this is where Simone's spicy information comes into play. Do you want to go into it? Genetic
my
evidence that shocked you.
Gosh, yes. No. I still have to post about it, but there's been this mystery going around on X recently related to new research came out. Here's one of the headlines covering it in Science Tech Daily. Birds in cities fear women more than men. Scientists don't know why.
So based on the stream, do you guys have any idea why? Right? If guys were hunting mammoths and women were hunting little things while they were foraging and things of that nature, do you think that women killed more birds than men, historically speaking? Probably so. Let's see what they have to say.
A consistent difference in how birds respond to approaching humans hints at hidden cues shaping animal behavior. An international team of scientists has uncovered an unexpected pattern in how city birds respond to people. Species such as great tits. Why do they have such great bird names? House sparrows and blackbirds take to flight sooner when approached by women than by men. The researchers say the finding is clear, but the reason behind it is still unknown. The study took place in 5 European countries and involved male and female participants matched for height and clothing, walking directly toward birds in parks and other urban green spaces. By measuring how close a person could get before the bird flew away, the team assessed what is known as flight initiation distance. On average, men were able to get about 1 meter, 3.3 feet closer than women before the birds took off. This pattern appeared consistently across all study locations, including Czechia, France, Germany, Poland, and Spain. It also held true across 37 species, from cautious birds like magpies to more tolerant ones such as pigeons. So Malcolm immediately turns to me and he's like, we know exactly why this is the case.
Yes, this is the question that explains everything we're going to talk about today, and I think proves without a doubt that this is not some Malcolm hallucination or some Malcolm manipulation of historical facts. There is really no other plausible way you could have gotten this, and it's actually, it's not surprising to me that scientists don't know this because they're not historians, and they don't study the parts of history that are hidden from people. But have you ever walked around an old European city?
Yeah,
If
like
you
Edinburgh.
have walked around an old European city, like let's say Edinburgh is where I've really noticed this, you will notice the second or third stories where you have windows, you will have these little nooks like right next to the window that look like they're made for a bird to make a nest there.
Yeah.
And you could say, that's really weird.
Or you
right?
think, how cute.
How cute. They must have been getting eggs from these nests. And it's no, that's not what these were used for. What these were used for is the housewife, because remember I said that women hunt small game, men
Mhm.
hunt big game. They would build these into the walls of their houses, and birds would come and nest in them, and they'd come and grab them and their young and cook them up and eat them.
It was
And that
Pigeon DoorDash.
Pigeon
Old
DoorDash,
edition.
yes.
Yeah.
But it likely wasn't limited to that. It was likely part of all of life back then. Men did not do things during this period like hunt down city birds. Women did. And what we're seeing in this is women did cross-culturally, across Europe, across locations, across species, and to such an extent that it is existentially baked into the DNA of multiple bird species.
Yeah. So crazy. It's so cool.
Could there not be stronger proof that women were actually at an extremely large level, enough level to have an evolutionary impact, disproportionately involved with the acquiring of basic proteins for the family when it was not big hunts? And keep in mind like how well this fits into our wider category. So suppose you have like medieval European society or something, and the man is out there doing his artisan thing, or out there trying to do some sort of a big deal or something like that, or building houses, and he needs to come home and there needs to be meat on the table, right? The woman is in charge of making sure that happens. That was the reality of medieval society, not what you have been told is the reality of medieval society. And we're seeing it here in the DNA. But you could say, okay.
Yeah, I mean, like when the guy is putting in some grueling hours to generate artisanal goods, he needed to be able to go home, get refueled, and get back to work rather quickly. So it was on the wife to go ahead and have something ready to go, whether it was cheese, whether it was bread, whether it was meat, something that was readily accessible so that he can get his calorie needs met so he can continue to do this. Because back in the day, like the idea of a 40-hour work week is something that is so modern from a historical context. Like that only really happened after like Henry Ford did the assembly line in the early 1900s. That's how yeah, Sabbath day. That was the deal. That we go ahead and rest. All right, let's continue.
But what about the nobles? Okay, certainly if we're talking about like the medieval to early modern, 1100 to 1700s, the noble women stayed at home as delicate little flowers and didn't do any labor, and the men did all the labor. It wasn't surely in that group the women did the majority of labor, and the men did the majority of status accruing activities. So noblemen's core roles were high risk, high return. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Specifically, what the men did was military service, crusades, tournaments, court intrigue, and warfare to defend and expand lands, gain favor, and seize territory. And men were often absent from their house, their property, and their investment from years at a time. A man going to war during this period meant being gone for like half a decade. That's what going on a crusade meant, that you could be gone for a decade. Women were managing most stuff. And if they weren't managing it beforehand, like you can be like, oh, well, when the man was home, the man managed most of the things. And it's like, no, the woman was subservient to the man, but the woman still did the majority of the work. It would have been stupid not to do it that way. The woman and the man both know that the man could at any time disappear for a 10-year period. And yet the woman has the man do most of the labor so that he has to teach her in like a few days or something, or a week or a month before he disappears. Like, that would be so stupid.
Yeah, this goes and reminds me of the Proverbs 31 woman again, where she did a lot of the work and a lot of the administration under the authority of her husband. And this is the same kind of thing, is because he would go and rule at the city gates, and that there would be times where he would be separate from the estate for an extended period of time. and he would not be able to directly manage the household. So the wife would manage the household in his stead under his authority, and that would be well understood. That was a normal and necessary functioning part of their society. Let's continue.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that most activities and tasks the woman would need to know would be highly seasonal. And so the man would not be able to teach them with enough time before they left on military duty. It just doesn't make any sense.
By the way, that they were called dews or ducats, the things that caught the pigeons.
Yeah.
And they were common enough. They were so common that sometimes basically like local agricultural communities would get really angry about them because the people in cities would actively cultivate like pigeons, especially because that was like your source of food if things got kind of lean. So you wanted to make sure there were lots of pigeons because then you would have something to eat, like when the winter came. But then in the nearby agricultural communities, they would eat the crops. And so there was this inherent conflict between manor houses and also urban dwellings that had these ducats in them and the people in farmlands, because they're like, dude, stop the pests. I hate this. This is really annoying. Versus the people like, this is my dinner. Like, yeah.
Like, anyway, so what did the women manage in European nobility? So they managed the day-to-day estate economy. So you've got to keep in mind that's most of the daily work of a noble is managing the estate's economy.
The servants and the stuff and the finances and the management and the food coming and going. And there's a lot going on.
They also oversaw agricultural production of the estate. Men did not do that. That was a woman's work on an estate. They collected rent and taxes. Oh, you thought the man was a woman? No, that was the woman, because again, the man may have to disappear at any moment.
Yeah.
They monitored tenants and goods, handling household finances, budgeting, directing servants, handling hiring and firing, ensuring food security. And they also ran, when husbands were away, defense and legal affairs. Coroners.
Yeah. So when we were talking about the idea of a feudal nation and things like that, where you would have everything on a fief subservient to a local lord, and then there's a chain of command up above that. At any point, the defense force of that local fief would sometimes need to be called to the defense of another fiefdom nearby. And so the men involved needed to go, and the women needed to be able to continue and carry on the management of the day-to-day responsibilities within the fiefdom. So this all makes perfect sense from a historical perspective.
And manorial records show women's work was overwhelmingly internal/stable, while man's was outwardly/risky. Okay, so let's go into things as they shifted, or we can go a bit cross-cultural here. Where do you see, well, I already talked about the hoe difference. So basically, if you're doing hoe or shifting-based agriculture, the women typically dominate that. And if you're doing plow-based agriculture, if you're wondering where plow-based agriculture never really dominated, here you're looking at sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America. And in these areas, women still do the majority of labor.
Is this why women?
Now, that had less to do with the individual culture and more to do with the soil quality and the fact that plowing could not effectively do the same thing there than it could in medieval Europe. So things to consider.
They're called hoes.
I don't know, but I'll tell you this. If you're like, come on, women don't do the majority of hard manual labor in pre-plow societies. And I'm like, okay, have you ever been to Latin America? And people are like, yeah, I mean, I guess I've been a little bit in Latin America. I'm like, did you ever drive in any rural region? And people are like, well, of course, I've been out of, I'm a worldly person. And I've been like, okay, so when you looked along the roadside and you saw people carrying 60-pound jugs on their head, which gender was doing that?
Sorry, no, it actually is in reference to a hoe. So hoes.
Women were called hoes because
some historians note that in early America, free Black women doing farm labor were sometimes dehumanized and literally called hoes, as if they were just tools, which connects the word to racism and slavery as well as sexism.
But it also shows that in early freed Black society, women did the majority of the farm labor when it was done.
Because they did the work with the hoes. Oh my God. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, but Simone, I'm trying to get you to grok this. You have been in rural Latin America, right?
Yes. Well, mostly urban.
Take an image in your head.
Okay.
You're driving down a rural road. You look out the side of a car, okay? You see somebody with a 60-pound jug of something on their head.
Oh, it's a woman, obviously. Yeah.
Always a woman.
Always a woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
People want to say, oh, in these primitive societies, it's men who are doing all the manual labor, all of the hard labor. And it's like, this is factually.
No, all the farming exposure people have had, like in developed countries, is post-industrial farming, where like, yeah, I mean, my evoked set of like, my AI generated image in my mind of, farm is like a man on a giant tractor that costs like $1 million, 500.
Yeah, because tractors were not invented until all like relatively recently compared to all of human history, where you would have hand tools up until the plow was invented. And then from there, in medieval Europe, the plow did such a better job of tilling soil and allowing for the planting and harvesting of crops that it did not make sense for women to do that. But in most other places, women would still use hand tools because the soil did not allow for it. And then now in modern times, we have these giant tractors that do most of modern industrialized farming. And so for the average person that doesn't really have a good idea of the history of how things used to be, that's just one of those things where, because we look at things from today, it causes us to misunderstand the past and to misunderstand roles between men and women. Let's continue.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Well, and I think that guys also get it wrong, where they're like, well, men are stronger, therefore that means that they did the more grueling manual labor. When, if you have actually been to many developing countries, what you will see is the most grueling manual labor, where pure strength isn't what's at play here, is predominantly done by women. And again, when we talk about in Latin America, you see them carrying this huge things of water on the head, the huge things of food on their heads, on the giant packs. If it's not on their head, you'll see the beleaguered woman who's like clearly in her early 30s, but like looks like she's like 55 or something, with the giant backpack on, going across the little trail or whatever. You go, it's not just Latin America, you go to Africa, you'll see this as well. You go
China too. Let's be clear, China too. Because
Yeah,
I've actually spent a lot more time in rural, like countryside China.
And what's really funny is because my wife does the same thing, where she like overpacks for everything because she's somebody that's kind of a worrywart. And this comes from like our early marriage, where she would much rather prepare extra than for us to have to go buy something along the way. And she was doing her part to help benefit the family's economy by being economical at that point in time. Whereas now we're in a position where, for the most part, we could just buy something and it's not a big deal. But she keeps a lot of those habits from our early marriage, which were the things that we needed to advance ourselves in terms of building wealth and things of that nature. Because she was economically minded early on in our marriage, that freed us up to be able to purchase assets and things of that nature. So very interesting dynamic that's at play here. So Rudy, so we're talking about how oftentimes men are very confused about the nature of labor between men and women, and how a lot of times when people look at traditional society, they'll think of the 1950s rather than back in the day, and look at modern housewives as the idea or the modern ideal, where it's not necessarily the case. And we're just doing an investigation of what roles between men and women looked like back in time, and then we'll take a look at how it's applicable in modern society. That's what we're doing today.
China and Japan, actually. Then
was it majority women doing the harder labor when you're talking?
Yeah.
Guys, you do not know how brain cut you are if a woman has convinced you, we just need to go back to the traditional way and I'll stay at home and you do all this stuff. Because you're so strong, look at your muscles. Could you open this jar for me? Oh, you see, as a woman, I could just never do anything. Meanwhile, these very same guys have been to Latin America, looked out a car and been like, oh, it's weird. The women are doing all the manual labor in this society. I wonder what the men are doing. Nothing. That must be a strange, primitive coincidence. We need to go back to this. We need to go back to a world where women raise children and do the labor, just like I've structured in my family. People are like... That is how women, because remember how guys are always like, women are hypergamous, right? And so how does hypergamy really work, right?
Some kind of crab mating dance? What was that supposed to be?
Well, no, it's men doing the spells.
Okay.
Hypergamous women. And it's like, okay, so if women are hypergamous, okay, they want a partner who is their better, okay?
They are, and they do. But what defines better? This is very straightforward. Let's continue.
In terms of status, in terms of physicality, whatever.
Yeah.
Why did that work historically? Because the women did the labor to justify their worth to the genetically superior male.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's the way our relationship is structured. I'm just saying
everyone knows it, Malcolm. It's fine. They've already said it many times.
I want the grateful woman who...
This is true. Like, in terms of looks, he is more attractive than she is. That's just what it is. And they admit it, and that's just what it is. So they're moving on from that.
Wants to do the labor, who is excited to do the labor. And there are a lot of women, like, you guys would be surprised when a woman hooks into a guy who she thinks is hypergamous to her, the amount of effort she will put into holding on to that guy. And if you're just like,
absolutely agree. If she is down bad for you, she will do all kinds of nonsense to go ahead and get your attention, retain your attention, and be everything to you if she thinks that you're the best that she can get. Let's continue.
okay, we're not playing any games. It's about labor. You put a 60-pound jug of water on your head. You walk 30 miles a day. Go.
And she's like, sir, yes, sir. Yeah. She's
Sorry,
right
yes,
there.
sir. Yes.
For
Thank
real,
you.
though.
This is the way I wanted to live.
Yeah.
Easy.
Which is, I think it's another reason why our culture is so toxic in that it would demean any woman for like accepting that frame, admitting that to herself. Like the successful framing presented to women is, okay, well now, if you like a man, you need to pretend that nothing he ever does is impressive, that you will never do any work for him ever, et cetera, that any work you do is an imposition and basically a crime against your entire gender and society. It's really messed up.
Yeah.
Which is something really wild to think about. So if a woman is attached to a man because of hypergamy and there's a status differential, it is in her best interest to serve the man's purposes and guidelines and mission in such a way to enable him to increase the status of the relationship and the family as a whole as she participates that on the way up. Now, this is a relatively rare phenomenon today, but has been the case for thousands of years that this has been the thing, and it has been looked at from different positions in different ways in different societies. But this is absolutely how many of the most successful families are structured, is by the sword and shield kind of mechanism where she works really hard to enable him to do the things that escalate the status of the relationship so that he continues to be her hypergamous best choice. And she benefits from, one, relationship goggles along the way. She benefits from his continued investment in her. This works out really well for both sides of the equation. Let's continue.
Let's go to a few other societies here so you can see that this is not just a European phenomenon of anything.
Hose was it. All I need was that. My God.
Literally named after hose. Okay, so if you go to West Africa, women have long dominated market trading and local commerce in the region, giving them significant control of household budgets, credit networks, and economic decision-making. In Ghana, market queens, elected female leaders,
Market queens
for specific commodities, food, good, textiles. They regulate prices, resolve disputes, organize self-help groups, and wield political economic influence. This includes mediating with authorities and ensuring food system stability. If you contrast this with men who do hoe-based farming, men often handle the initial land clearing for certain crops, while women prefer the ongoing labor-intensive but lower-risk tasks of plowing, weeding, harvesting, and processing, plus the dominant role in marketing the surplus. Men were involved in higher risk external activities like hunting, fishing, and long-haul trade, or craft production. So keep in mind, again, you're seeing this here. What do men do? It is higher risk.
So this is something that is done cross-culturally. It isn't just Europe. It's not just Africa. This is happening in Asia. This is happening globally. As people are developing their societies based on their level of technological development, this is something that is ubiquitous. This isn't just something that's Western European or American in nature. Let's continue.
Things, higher artisan training things. Women do the lower risk things and the more economically focused things. And again, I'm saying you need to alter your perception of what is a male and female role in the economy, not saying that you need to take on a woman's role. You just happen to have been wrong about what the woman's role was.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised because we have a like pretty educated fan base, and it made me realize that even within the educated world, how
Look, they probably knew but forgot, because I would just say the psyop is so far in the other direction. It's just a memory hold. I don't think this is about ignorance. It's about repeated blunt force of propaganda in the other direction.
Yeah, it's feminists go out there and they're like, women were Vikings and women hunted mammoths and women. And so when they hear something like women were involved in, in hunting meat in like 70% of hunter-gatherer societies, they just throw it out because they're like, oh, that must be biased scientist nonsense, right?
And they don't ask what the deal actually was or whether it was true or what the actual statistic was about. Is yes, they would be involved in 78% of the hunts, but were they hunting the mammoths? No, they were hunting the field mice. They were hunting the shrews. They were hunting birds, things of that nature, smaller, less violent, less volatile game. That's what they were doing in this. But yet the feminist social order would go ahead and have us to believe that women owned the world. And then at the same time, they were completely subjugated by the patriarchy. No, men and women ordered themselves in society in ways that made sense for each family to do and for society to proliferate and continue over time based on their circumstances. Let's continue.
And then they read the fine print and it was mice and rabbits and squirrels. It's like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like the basic kind of meats that would be easier to get on a daily basis to ensure that you get the nutrition that they needed. And it's like, and this is how hypergamy worked traditionally. And it's like, oh, that's why a man would choose a lesser woman because she was walking to and from with a 60-pound gourd on her head. You know, like
because she was useful to him, because she had skills and she was a proven asset to him. This is why a lot of times there was a bride price involved in older societies where there was a notable loss of labor on the part of the father when a woman would marry into another family. This is what was the deal with that. And then later on, you had dowries where the wife would go ahead and have money that is paid into a conjugal fund for both of them so that they could build something for themselves, and the father of the bride would pay into that for the most part. That's how marriage transactions happen. Shout out to the gold pill. Let's continue.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to India.
Okay.
So men, again, handled plowing, irrigation, and market sales. So this is one where women handled more market stuff. Women perform lower variance work like sowing, transplanting, weeding, harvesting, gleaning, post-harvest processing, plus livestock, kitchen gardens, and household budgeting. They contributed to 70% of agricultural labor in many regions. So again, they're still doing the majority of agriculture.
These are also, keep in mind, like on our episode on divisions of labor in the household and what women report enjoying more. These are things that women still enjoy. In surveys, these are the types of activities women enjoy. These are also more bureaucratic activities, more routine activities, very predictable activities. And you see this also in like the lower rates of female entrepreneurship. Women on average are just that we don't like the high risk, high reward. It's very stressful. Like I know you're constantly trying to loop me into like your VC stuff. It freaks me out. And you're constantly frustrated with the fact that I'm like,
you don't fully check the product beforehand. You don't fully, you're just like, I'm going to do the performative minimum when it comes to high risk, high reward.
Yeah, because I find it extremely stressful and aversive versus.
So it just goes to show how men and women are instinctively different in a lot of ways, where women are basically in today's society doing the same kinds of jobs that they were doing 100 years ago. They're still actively in nursing. They're still actively in childcare. They're still actively in education. They're actively in administrative roles. They're in bureaucracies. These are things that by far are things that appeal to women's sensibility, things that are stable, things that are knowable, things that are predictable, things that have to do with people, things that are less risky. Whereas men are typically doing things where there is more physical risk to them, like we're on oil rigs, we're handling a lot of the infrastructure stuff. We are the ones that are doing most of the entrepreneurial endeavors. We are the ones as men that are more risk tolerant, and we're willing to go ahead and put ourselves on the line for the higher benefit, usually that's entailed by it. Let's continue.
It's like the routine stuff, which would literally drive you to madness, or if not, send ambulance. I can do that and be very happy with it.
By the way, for the people who want to use a super search feature on RFAB, it can be used on things like episode, because every one of the models that runs on it has the capability of searching the internet. Yeah. So you could put something like the URL of this episode in and been like, is this accurate? What's accurate? What's not accurate?
So which is pretty cool. It's really well done. It's really well done.
And not just that. I mean, I do encourage you.
Let's skip ahead to colonial America. Let's see how things go in the US.
I've often, like in Europe, ran the estates during the male absence. Now, if your wife has been running your estate during your absence, not only, again, do you need to prep her for doing this, but you can be like, okay, but after the men came back and they knew the wives could do it, didn't they take over again? And it's like, no, because they were the dominant member of the household. And if you're the dominant member of the household and the other person can do something competently, you don't just take the work back. I'm sorry if that...
Absolutely. So if she is competent and she's doing the work, why in the world would you go ahead and take that work away from her when she is proven that she can handle it? Whereas you as the man could go ahead and continue to find the higher leverage, higher opportunities to elevate the status of the family even further. So if she is doing the things that make sense for her to do, to watch over the estate, to watch over the home, and to handle a lot of these smaller things in terms of lifestyle maintenance and all of these kind of things, Why in the world, as the man, would you take over any of those tasks? So the idea of things like chore play and all of that, I find that to be detestable, but we see a lot of feminists in the modern society go ahead and tell men, oh, just do some of the chores and things will be better. It's like, no, dudes should be doing things that raise the status of the family, and they'd end up with much better results in terms of quality of care, quality of the family, quality of their intimate life. All of these things would improve if guys would go ahead and do those things instead of doing household chores. It doesn't make sense for the most part. Let's continue.
Paints men in a bad light, but that is the reality of actually being a dominant member within a household. So let's go to colonial America. All right, because people can be like, well, this isn't the American tradition, is it? Men focused again on high risk work. They did clearing land, which we have a lot of stuff from, and they did some hunting, a lot of politicking. Like men were really focused on
Think about like John and Abigail Adams, the
Yeah,
classic
John and
American
Abigail
power
Adams.
couple. Yeah.
We have really good, if you're not familiar with John and Abigail Adams, Abigail managed all of the investment, all of the estates, all of the hiring and firing, all of the everything. And John went to do the historically important stuff of setting up the American nation.
There's also Martha Washington too. Yeah, I mean, this is
Yeah,
like
Martha
this was the format. It was the format.
It was the format.
Yeah, it was the format of aristocracy. You had women managing things and men doing historically significant things. And so men would be remembered throughout the annals of history for doing these historically significant things. And then because the women would take care of the maintenance of the estate and the care and the administration of things, they would be written into history as this guy's wife. Let's continue.
Women made sure that the man had their allowance, and the man made sure that the woman's name would be mentioned in history. Okay, that is the difference between the two roles. That is the way Simone and I structure our relationship, and this is the way I'm just going to straight out and say it is the better way to structure a relationship. Now that I see how you
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and piggyback on this. This is how my wife and I go ahead and structure our relationship too. She goes ahead and handles a lot of administrative matters. She handles a lot of relationship things. She handles a lot of the regular caring and feeding of children, educating of children, things of this nature. She goes ahead and handles a lot of the supply, distribution, and things of that case. This is a really interesting thing, and I think this is really nice. This is a good way to organize a family.
Ubiquitous it is throughout history, and that any other mechanism for structuring relationships has largely been experimental and short term, like male wage labor for a female who sits at home all day. And mind you, even at the height of that particular experiment, like the 50s, all of the women were out of their mind on drugs and going crazy, right? Like it wasn't working, okay? It may have had some like veneer of working in like Hollywood. But
if it worked, we wouldn't have needed all those benzos. No, for sure it wasn't working. It was not working.
Coked out of their mind. They were benzoed out of their mind. They barely had any idea what was happening, because you cannot take a smart, intelligent person and say, here, stay at home, do nothing all day, right? Like that sets you up. Okay. What about women? Women did, well, we don't even need to go into it. You've basically gone over Martha Washington, Abigail Adams. I hope most Americans are fairly aware of those stories and what those women did. And they were not considered exceptional for their period. Nobody was like, oh, Abigail Adams, what like a weird lesbian she is for managing the estate or something, right? Like
cottagecore lesbian Abigail Adams with all the children somehow, but whatever.
Again, if you go to the backwoods, you go to the frontier lifestyles. I mean, I'm sure everybody is aware how much labor the women did in the frontier America, right? Like, are you not? Like, do you not know that women basically managed everything except protecting the property and plowing and clearing fields? So like, I assume it's like people are aware of this. They just don't reflect on it, I guess. I'm a little
well, it's just a matter of division of labor. That's just kind of the deal. This is what men and women have oriented themselves to, and they specialize in trade with one another and within community. This is something that has been the case for an extended period of time, and something that makes for an effective kind of family synergy between a husband and a wife. You got the guy that is doing things that are uniquely according to his talents, skills, and abilities, and the woman goes ahead and handles things in accordance with her natural proclivities. And then when you go ahead and leave her bored, she's just going to go ahead and scroll TikTok all day. And that's just not a good thing for either side of that relationship. Let's continue.
Like
it runs so contrary to the popular narratives, I guess. Like, I think it's, I don't know. And here's the funny thing too, is also that there was no
cleared the land.
There was no feminist argument against this, weirdly, right? When women complained about things, and you did even a very, unflattering to women episode on women who hated men who were early feminist activists. This was not a complaint. They were not like, man, I'm so angry about the fact that I had to do all this work and that I have to do all this work. No, that was like, it just comes naturally to women. Women are workhorses.
Because we want the family to stay alive,
but like,
right?
I think that's another reason why this just doesn't come up, is that there was never really a narrative to it. And that now the narrative is just so heavily on like, any work that women do is considered so unforgivable that the mere, like, the fact that we have this concept of the mental load, that like, I have to think about things.
Which is insane, by the way. So the idea of the mental load oftentimes is a matter of anxiety being induced by not doing the things that they should be doing. Whereas if they would just do the work would be accomplished and they would have less things to be anxious about. So that's what the majority of mental load is when women are talking about it today. And it's crazy, and it's not something that we as men should really like entertain. We should go ahead and help them out with systems and things of that nature so they could get through the work, so they could go ahead and occupy themselves in other ways. Let's continue.
This is horrible. Like, I don't know.
And I don't think it's because men look at history and they're aware. So if we look at like colonial period, it's like, okay, what did women do? Okay, so women did cooking, baking, preserving, which is very important in terms of like exporting long-term family life, etc. Soap and candle making, clothing making, child rearing, but we're putting that aside because most people are aware of that. Gardening and livestock, weeding, harvesting, milking, cheese making, and curing and often preparing of pelts. So, you hear about those things and you're like, okay, but how hard is like every one of those individual? Do you know how hard like just milking and cheese making is? It is brutal. Do you know how hard weeding is when you are manually weeding, not a garden? I don't know how many men have weeded a garden, which is brutal. Weeding an entire field to feed a family. Okay, we are talking about extremely serious amounts of labor here.
Oh, yeah. And not only that, you don't have things like Roundup. You don't have chemical agents. You are doing it physically by hand so that the weeds don't go ahead and choke out the crops so that your family can be well fed. And not only your family, but oftentimes you would have excess, which is what you would sell at the market. So you would keep that which is needed for your family to eat so that you can go ahead and survive and perpetuate your line. And then you had extra that you would sell to the market. And if weeding wasn't regularly done, the nutrients that should have gone to those crops ended up going to the weeds, and the weeds would choke them out, which is why weeding, like all of these arable acres of farmland, was incredibly necessary. And this is stuff that women typically did back in the day.
And backbreaking labor, brutal labor. Okay, let's keep going here. Then people are like, okay, but by the time the Industrial Revolution happened, 1790s to 1910s, and here we're talking about like proto-wage labor, surely women stopped working? And the answer is no. Actually, in the early days of industrialization, we still had women working really heavily. In fact, we have entire like towns that were like female labor camps, basically, especially women who didn't want to get married. They worked really heavily. But here's where you're beginning to have married men begin to care for women at the beginning of industrialization. But this is a modern phenomenon, and a phenomenon that never really worked and culminated with drugged out women, barely coherent. Okay? Women want to be turned into workhorses. They want to be labored. And I'm just encouraging us to break this particular myth that somehow misogynists have adopted. And like, let's go back to it and be like, no. A woman's job is in the field. It's in the barn. It's not just in the kitchen. It's the children, it's the education, and it's most other things as well. And
yeah, but very clearly it's predictable, routine, repetitive, at-home labor, which
a lot of times the husband goes ahead and sets up the systems and the processes, writes her out a manual and says, hey, here's the things that I need you to do. Follow the script. And the women involved are like, yeah, I could go ahead and follow a script. I don't have to go ahead and think about all of the variables involved. I just have a flow chart that has been provided to me by my husband to do the thing. This makes so much sense. And this is what I see in the various businesses that I own as well, is I see that the women under my employ are typically more oriented to processes and procedures that other people have set up and enforcing them. Whereas guys are a lot more apt to look at the systems themselves and try to go ahead and get more efficiencies out and improve them over time. Whereas I don't see that activity as much in my female employees as I do in my male employees. So things to think about. Let's continue.
You know, you make it sound so horrible. You're on the flip side of it, it's this very, you know, cottagecore, cozy, hobbit-like, romantic life that I think a lot of people crave, you know, and wish, you know, they want to retire to that. That is the dream.
Well, I mean, we can go back to this insofar as we have work from home again. If you look at our structured relationship, what does Simone do? She does emails, she does taxes, she does the bureaucratic sort of low risk work of managing employees, managing hiring and firing. She manages clients. She manages all of that stuff. What do? I manage building new things, right? I manage building out RFab. I manage building out like the new features like Super Search. I've got to work on the card game, which apparently is having some bugs. I work on our vibe coding platform, which you can use with the agents on the website. I do our, you know, not safe for work chatbot stuff on rfab.ai. Like wherever there is work in terms of building stuff, that is where I am. Where there is work in terms of maintaining stuff, that is where Simone is.
I definitely co-sign this whole relationship structure. Like I said, my wife and I, we have it similarly built out, where I'm going ahead and climbing mountains, slaying dragons, and bringing home treasure. And she's doing the things that make a house a home. She does the things that directly support me. If I need certain things, I just go ahead and give her a task list of things that I need done so that I don't have to think about doing those things. And they're just done for me. I go ahead and give her a list and she just takes care of it. Whereas I'm freed up to go ahead and continue to buy property, continue to do the things that make sense to advance the overall status of the family. And that's how we divide up our labor. Makes a lot of sense. Fantastic way to orient a family.
Our relationship could not be more radically traditional if you tried. Which is, I think, really interesting. And it's something that we should emphasize more in interviews, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah, it was never something we planned, to be fair. It's just kind of how things shook out.
The natural roles of males and females. And
Yeah.
if you operate with
because we heavily believe in leaning into our aptitudes and lower token cost. Like the way we sometimes describe it is like, look, you know, Malcolm could make dinner, but it would cost him 58 tokens and it cost me 7. So I'm going to make dinner. I could plausibly, you know, build some new startup, but it would cost me 8,000 tokens and it costs him like, you know, 300. So let's go. Like it's so obvious over time.
Yeah. Well,
and because we orient ourselves in this way, we have more energy for each other when the labor is done for the day. So it is very rare that my wife and I do not have energy to spend time together to strengthen our relationship and to strengthen the relationship of the family as a whole, because we specialize in the various things. Oh, and then just to let you know, they're both really conservative. They're not liberals, just to give you a heads up. It's just, we see things very differently. So that's just what the deal is. So that's the baseline of this thing, where they talk about how the idea of traditional marriage and traditional goals where the woman just stays at home and scrolls on TikTok is basically just this nonsense thing that has happened in recent times and is not historically accurate or a representation at all about how life was and how life can continue to be. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. This one is called Courtesans and Concubines, Why We Need Them Back, where it talks about how a lot of times people are confused about what they want in a wife, and they're saying on the surface they want these things, but then in an actuality, they're looking at completely different things. So let's dive into this. This is a really cool one. And I'll start our playback speed at 1.25. Let's look at... Caught this one. Such weak and girly men now. Yeah, relatively speaking, there's not a whole lot of guys. There's a lot of overweight guys. There's a lot of guys that don't have a whole lot of muscularity nowadays because we live in an information-driven society as opposed to an agrarian society or a society that values manual labor over everything else. All right, let's go ahead and continue with this next video.
What I like about the term courtesan is it helps separate between a true housewife and the more modern trad wife, which I think is closer to a courtesan. If you look at the trad wife, right, the trad wife makes everything look pretty, right? She does up the house. She does the baking from scratch and everything. And she's doing all that for appearance. She's doing all that to sell that he has a certain type of wife. but like she's not actually managing the family budget, right? Like she's not actually managing the deeper parts of the family. And many people who society at large would confuse, they would say, well, this woman stays at home and educates the kids as part of her duties, therefore she's the same type of thing as this trad woman.
Specific.
Right. So this is a very stark contrast between the kind of dynamic we were talking about in the last video, where there was a sword and a shield dynamic. Whereas most of the time nowadays, when people think about a trad wife, what they're thinking about is something that traditionally was associated with somebody who was a courtesan. They were somebody who was there for the pleasure of the husband and to make him look good and to make things aesthetically pleasing, and not so much the idea of being visibly and familially productive for the family. Let's continue.
We'll be delineating two categories of relationships. One, the courtesan relationship, where the woman believes that their core job vis-a-vis their partner is just their partner's pleasure and reproducing. Whereas the other, the true wife or housewife, sees their job as being fully integrated with their husband's life and advancing the interests of their family.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Today, we are going to be expanding on a concept that a fan came up with in response to a previous video. And it is that we should bring back the concept of concubine. And when I first heard this, I was like, well, we don't want to normalize.
All right. For those of you who don't know what a concubine is back in the day, there would be a wife and there would be concubines, and they were of different status. And generally speaking, so if we go ahead and look at the Mosaic law, there were different qualifiers for heirship and things of that nature in terms of how inheritance would work between the children of wives and the children of concubines, and they had different roles in society. Let's continue.
Sort of, promiscuous behavior in this regards. There's a lot of negative social externalities for doing it. But after they laid it out for me, I'm like, actually, we need to start having a conversation about this. We need to normalize this concept. This is a good concept. So let me explain. We had a video where we basically go over the history of male and female labor. And what we pointed out, using a lot of statistics, a lot of historical examples, is the modern idea that throughout history, men mostly did all the labor and women mostly stayed at home and did education and child rearing is just completely historically anachronistic. Women actually did the majority, and I mean the majority of like grueling labor, like repetitive
subsistence labor. So sort of your baseline food and everything else was more or less.
Yeah. So if you're talking about like the majority of human history was during the hunter-gatherer period, that's 95% of human history. Women were doing 60 to 70% of the calories in those societies. And then you transition to an agricultural society. And in most agricultural societies, women do the farming until the plow was invented. And then somebody else was like, and this is men. Men plow for like 200 years and go, F it, I'm making a tractor. Women do hoe-based farming for literally thousands of years and continue to do it exactly the way they've always done it.
So this goes to show how when guys are involved in something and they're like, yeah, this sucks, we need to go ahead and get this better, we will go ahead and invent things to make our lives easier. Whereas a lot of times women, generally speaking, will go ahead and do the thing that's set before them, and they won't really question it so much a lot of times. And when the labor ends up getting back on this, the guys were like, oh, plowing, this is a lot better. This is a lot more efficient than having a bunch of women out in the fields for most of the day. But now I'm stuck having to go ahead and work this plow. How do I work myself out of a job? And then we invent the tractor. We invent the engine. We invent things to make life easier. That's one of the core differences between men and women. Let's continue.
By the way, hoe-based farming, the fact that Simone loved from that episode that she just cannot get enough of, is we pointed out that the idea of women staying at home and not really doing much except for child rearing and education came from the like sort of middle-class wealthy whites in America during a short window, like the 1910s to the 1970s. And it was like, well, what about poorer people during that period? And this is where the word hoe comes from. It was because specifically Black women, but though I suspect that this is like, nowadays they try to racialize a lot of things that weren't racialized. It probably just meant poor women in general were hoes because they worked the farm, and that's what made them hoes. So it didn't mean a promiscuous woman, it meant a poor, uneducated woman. But we start talking about all this. And by the way, if you're wondering, like, what were the types of work that men did historically, they typically did things tied to war or things tied to artisanship. So if you needed a cobbler or a woodcutter or a builder or an architect or a sailor, like if it required a huge amount of skill outside of textiles, it was typically men doing it. And don't underestimate how much work textiles were, or how much work other things that people dismiss like weeding. Weeding your garden is one thing. Weeding a field that's feeding a family is significantly more work than plowing it. For anyone who's ever weeded, weeding is difficult, backbreaking, and recurring labor, but which was typically a woman's job, by the way. But when in the sort of fallout from this episode, people were going through it and they said, you know what? Because we were talking about the way that women historically actually structured their relationship with men, right? Like if the man was doing some sort of artisanal job, like say a butcher or a cobbler or a blacksmith, the wife would typically manage the book, manage the finances, manage the storefront, manage the marketing, manage the sourcing of goods. And we put this out there and we put it out with the concept of like a sword and shield relationship in a modern context, which is like the wife is in charge of the more stable part of the income and the man is in charge of like entrepreneurship, like big fish, like moving the family forwards. And a lot of people who are actually, and I think what we would consider more trad relationships, still really related to this concept. They were like, well, like while I, or because we have a lot of housewife listeners, so while I or my wife, this was actually more rare, take on what society would call a housewife job, that is not actually what I'm doing. I actually manage our investments, I manage our finances, I manage our taxes, I manage, you know, the sort of procuring and stocking the home with supplies, getting things fixed. I manage like a huge variety of stuff. And we then began to talk about how there's a new type of woman that has come to exist that isn't this type of woman. So this type of woman is engaging in what the married wife has always done, right? Which is to say, they join, and like historically, if you went to a blacksmith historically, right? And you sat him and his wife down and you're like, look, lady, I know you manage the storefront and the money and the taxes and all that, but you shouldn't, right? Like your husband should manage all that. And what she would of course say is, but then he's going to have less time to make stuff.
Yeah.
And you're like,
Now, bear in mind, back then, the economy was based on things and not on money, right? Whereas nowadays, our economy, we go ahead and trade for money more than we trade for goods. And so this is a very different kind of mechanism where if we were to go ahead and have the specialized artisan spend more time doing the artisanal thing, the thing that is more valuable in the marketplace, this enables them to move up the social hierarchy much better. And this is also seen in a modern context where like a dude wants to start a construction company and he could be doing all the sales. He could be doing the customer acquisition. He could be doing all of the supply needs. He could be doing all the taxes and things like that. But every additional task that he puts on, every single additional task makes it so that he is less able to sell more contracts and to do more work. So that's how you divide up the labor in a modern context on a small scale. And then on a bigger scale, the dude will just hire up a front office staff to go ahead and handle a lot of the things that the wife formerly was doing. And then she would graduate into other tasks. Maybe she would be primarily in marketing. And then eventually you go ahead and hire that out. And then now you're no longer a small business, but you're a bigger business. And for the most part, the owner and the owner's wife are not directly involved in day-to-day tasks at any point. Now they have managers and staff to go and handle most of the affairs of the business. That's what's different. Let's continue.
well, yeah, but like, you know, he's a man, you're a woman, and she'd look at you and be like, but like that money doesn't just go to him, it goes to the entire family. You're telling me arbitrarily poorer so that I can what, sit at home and twiddle my thumb all day? Like what's the advantage to me to stepping back from this when our fortunes, as used to historically be the case in relationships, are completely tethered together? As he does better, I do better. As he does worse, I do worse. Why would I not help him in the ways that I can help him? And people said, there's this new type of woman who doesn't think that way. And this is where the concept of concubine makes sense in bringing back, is that be they married or not, there is a certain type of woman who does not believe that she should be adding anything substantial to the relationship in terms of intellectual labor or labor more broadly, right? Like
she's purely ornamental.
She is purely.
Does this sound really familiar in a modern context? I think that a lot of women will take this position and believe themselves to be so valuable for their ornamental value that they don't believe that they should contribute anything to the household. Let's continue.
Ornamental. And she may still have his kids, as concubines did historically, but she doesn't, she's not a part of like a team where both people are pushing things forwards. And the moment I heard this, I was like, that's a really good effing point. Because if we can renormalize the concept of a concubine, we can renormalize the fear of being seen as a concubine. Now, thoughts, Simone, before I yap further, as they say on Twitch now that I know, because I do the Twitch. They say yapping.
Are we old?
By the way, did you know what a raid is on Twitch? I didn't know what a raid was.
Is it when a bunch of people from someone else's stream go into yours?
Yeah, that's what I thought it was. It's not.
What is it?
So what happens is when you sign off Twitch, because you'll likely have a bunch of people still watching you, like
Let's go ahead and move on.
One
To
reason why I like the idea of
relevant
the courtesan
content.
is I think that it at least helps to create, it helps to highlight what a normal wife actually is, and that this thing that people are optimizing for now as a default, which is the courtesan. And most people now, when they're looking for a partner,
That's interesting. So this is true in a lot of ways. I think that a lot of women will try to optimize to be the equivalent of a courtesan, where they're valued for their looks and their reproductive value, and less for their mental acuity and what they can contribute to a team. Because I think that feminism in a lot of ways has really drawn out the idea of mutual interdependence between a husband and a wife, and both of them playing complementary roles in a relationship. And so a lot of times the feminist social order will go ahead and pull men and women apart and try to convince women that either they are going solo or they are an ornament for a high value guy. And we see how women are reacting to that, generally speaking, in our society. Let's continue.
Seem to be describing a courtesan, but an unpaid courtesan. And I think that's also really important. They want a companion that is attractive, that will make them happy, that is going to like entertain them. But for whatever reason, they also expect that they're not going to have to like pay for or support this person like sugar daddy style. And that just is inherently unsustainable.
I mean, I think a lot of them do play.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? That's the trade-off. If you're going to have somebody for more or less purely ornamental and pleasure value, then you need to be prepared to support them in that role and guide them and provide all of the necessary accoutrements for that to happen, right? And so a lot of guys are under the mistaken impression that, you know, getting with a 10 or getting with a 9 is just the same as getting with an adjustable 6 that's willing to work for the family to continue on. Let's continue.
Well, I actually like these two versions. So let's break this out, because I think you're creating an interesting distinction here, which makes it even worse, right? Where a woman may say, I'm not a courtesan, I go to work and I earn my own money, right? And it's like, actually, you're worse than a courtesan in that part. Like, I don't know what word we should make for this type of woman, but I'll describe what I'm talking about.
Women do it to men too. They want the man to be attractive and to entertain them and make them happy and pleasure them. But they also don't expect to like invest anything in them.
Expect men to pay into a family coffer. There are many women who do the exact opposite, and this is what I'm talking about here: the lower than a courtesan woman. This is a woman who gets married to a guy, and she sees her role as entertaining him, having sex with him, you know, and entertaining can mean like playing video games with him or something, you know, whatever it means, to watching movies with him at night, you know, whatever, right? Like courtesan stuff, because this is the modern version of courtesan stuff. But worse than all of that, she still has a job, but she takes the income she makes from that job and she treats it as entirely her own, right? Like it's money just.
So this goes back to the whole his money is my money and my money is my money thing. So not only is she not fully devoted to this man's pleasure as a courtesan, but she is worse in that she is spending 160 hours a month working for someone else and submitting to somebody else's authority, and then treating that money as her own and not part of the conjugal fund. That's why it's worse. Let's continue.
For her, this woman is less, and I'm sure everyone has seen women online who are like this. The guy makes money and it's for everyone in the family. The girl makes money, it's just for her fun stuff.
Is that
right?
really common?
Very common. Yeah.
I mean, I watch a lot of like couples finance shows, and that's not what I see. I don't think that is what you think it is.
Okay. Well, if anyone is doing this, they are less than a courtesan, because they're literally an unpaid courtesan. He's not even keeping you, right? Like you're out there being a hoe to capitalism and being a hoe for your husband.
Well, I understand that, but I think that's a straw man. I think what's really common is one, I mean, we
audience in the comments, do you know people who have done this?
Yeah.
I know people on both sides of this, and it is a thing that happens. And there's a lot of women that are like, his money is our money and my money is my money. This is ubiquitous in our society. And I think that when Simone is taking a look at this and looking at it through the prism of finance shows, that she is failing to recognize that there's small sample bias, and that the people that are willing to go on these finance shows are usually not this kind of person. Let's continue.
Continue, Simone.
Recently, there was a term for like courtesan that was more modern, and it was trophy wife, and people did treat this as a profession. We know people who absolutely like as, and like by treat this as a profession, I mean treat it as a profession. I mean like watched corn to learn how to perform as people might desire, starved self to fit in right size, invested in the right clothing. And then, once actually paired and we'll say employed as a trophy wife, working extremely hard to make dinners special, to make holidays special, to provide all of the, pleasure and enjoyment. Famously, when Marie Antoinette was first introduced to the French court and to King Louis the 15th, she made an inquiry about the king's courtesan at the time. I think it was Madame Bovary. I'm so bad with names, but
hold on. Simone's like, I'm bad with names, that she cannot remember one of the king's courtesans during a particular period of the French court. This shows you the level of history nerd that Simone is.
I know. I can name most of them for Louis XIV, because the book on the love life of King Louis XIV is amazing. And there's Athénaïs, there's Madame de Maintenon, there's all these amazing women, but I think it's Madame de Bovary. Anyway, so Marie Antoinette, this young teen bride of King Louis, future King Louis XVI, asks, who is this woman? And essentially her advisor, another noble woman in the court, is like, oh, that is, so-and-so. Her job is to give pleasure to the king. And her being this like really innocent, kind of like sheltered, Austrian woman would be like, well, then, we are rivals because I want to give pleasure to the king. And she's like, oh, you don't understand, girl. Like, but like, it was very well understood that
she knew where her place was. And the thing was that that was a different time and different standards. And like, this is a thing that happened in nobility a lot, is that different women had different purposes in the court when involved with the king, right? And so we saw this a lot in the Old Testament with polygyny and things of that nature, where high status guys had multiple wives, and there was a lot of stuff going on. So very interesting things, and seeing how even in a pseudo-modern context, Louis the 16th, Louis the 15th, that time frame is relatively modern by, historical standards. Let's continue.
Their profession was to give pleasure to this person. And I think that people who took the trophy wife career seriously, and we know people who did, understand that their job is to give pleasure to their partner and also to raise their social status, because it was understood that as a trophy wife, they have to make them look good in a certain way. And so they dress their husbands carefully. They manage their husband's style. They manage the husband's household. They make their houses look good. They host events. And that was taken very seriously. And I think that role really degraded, and you can see it very well in the Real Housewives series, where suddenly this idea of the trophy wife was transitioned to, no, she is the main character. She is not an ornamental courtesan whose job is to give pleasure to her husband and raise, make him look good and make him happy.
Yeah, that's really interesting how the women in the Real Housewives shows were role reversed, basically, where in traditional society, we would go ahead and look at the adventures of the men that led these women to have the quality of life that they did. Is very interesting to see that difference, right? Is in a lot of ways, these men strove for decades to earn a spot so that these women could enjoy a level of luxury that they did. And it completely reframed how society worked in a lot of ways, and like our conventional way of looking at it. So let's continue.
Her job is to just like, I'm going to do what I want, and I have my businesses, and I'm going to, sell dog shoes for charity or something like that.
Yeah.
And they're incredibly dysfunctional, et cetera, et cetera.
I started this charity because I saw so many dogs having to walk the hot streets of Orlando without any protection on their feet. But it's also personal. This one time, I lost my high heels on the beach. And I was looking around for them like over half an hour. Oh, it was awful. I told myself. So with your help, each dog will receive their own pair of high heels. And for that, you can be very proud.
So that role fell apart. And I think as that role fell apart, we sort of forgot that this was a profession and a track in marriage, and that there are two tracks. You can be a trophy wife, but you have to be a trophy wife for someone who can afford to keep you. And I think what it also degraded was that a lot of people just assumed that they were going to marry functionally a courtesan and not a business partner. We forgot that.
Yeah, I mean, that's very different. Like back in the day, it was very different tracks that you were generally viewing yourself to be. Either you were going to marry into a family to be a contributing member of the family, to propagate a line and to build something from nothing or build something from a head start that was given to you in terms of the dowry and things of that nature, or you were going to marry up into aristocracy and be a courtesan. And it was just a very different set of circumstances and very different tracks that were available at the time.
Marriage was an arrangement, first and foremost, to just establish paternity of children and like inform the community to like, don't sleep with my wife because I need to make sure that like the line of paternity is secure, but also to establish a business alignment and have a husband and wife work together. And we, with the Industrial Revolution, dropped that.
Right? Like when you are the same person, we had a documentary and we were asking it recently, like, when do you guys fight? Like, tell us about fights. And I'm like, we just don't have fights. Like,
we have tactical disagreements, which we resolve by obtaining better evidence.
Yeah. Like, why would we fight when we have the same goals? Any disagreement we have is an academic disagreement.
The key distinction here is that people need to understand that if you are hiring the equivalent of a paid entertainer and performer, it is your responsibility to be able to pay for and keep them. And that person needs to understand that it is their responsibility to in turn perform and give pleasure.
Yeah, see, that's the thing, is know what you're hiring for and know what your responsibilities are on both sides of that coin to see what the duties and responsibilities are and what is actually required to maintain that lifestyle. And a lot of people are thinking about this from the perspective of just one side or the other, rather than taking a look at both ends of that equation to figure out how it goes.
And make you look good. And our media landscape has degraded even that, especially through the Real Housewives series, has just made it been like, oh no, they don't live to make their husbands happy.
What I find interesting about the point that you're making here, by the way, and it is just absolutely a fascinating point, which is that the idea of renormalizing the concept of the courtesan doesn't just help trad wife marriages, it also helps courtesan marriages, because it helps remind them of what their actual role is in the marriage when they adopt this. They are both disposable and less than a true wife. If they are not contributing their intellect. And note here, we had one follower reach out in regards to this, and he's like, well, you know, I'm very successful now. I run a company now. So how am I going to find a wife? Like, do I have to leave it all behind and start something new with them? Right? Like, how do I make this work? Right? And there's multiple ways you can make it work. One is to integrate somebody who shows competence and diligence and work ethic into your existing operation, right? Like, that is something that a lot of people have done historically. But then another is, which is probably better, is figure out what they value that you value, right? Presumably, if you're making a lot of money with your company, there's some way you want to change the world, and working with them to start that organization, right? Like
So that makes a lot of sense. So when you have a certain amount of wealth and you don't need a wife's contribution to the family wealth building engines that exist in a family, what you can do is then you can start charity organizations. And you've seen this ubiquitously handled by rich people. They go ahead and do this as a way to, one, employ the women involved in the family, and two, for them to leave some kind of lasting legacy. This is how it has traditionally worked and continues to work to this day.
A wife who is working for your combined goals can still work philanthropically, right? Like, but so long as they're effective at it, and they're not just doing it to boost their own ego and status, right? And you'll be able to tell this very quickly. Do they actually care about these things, or are they interested in status boosting? Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and is it status boosting of the family, or is it status boosting of herself? And so that's the real big question to be asked here, is if you're going to integrate a new wife into an existing architecture that you have built out, say you're a guy and you have been single, you're basically a confirmed bachelor, what in the world would you be doing if you're not building something together while you start something that is of your common values, if she is competent and able to do that? Because if not, then you're going to have internal conflicts about this. Let's continue.
And so this is what I want from the audience. I want, what is the lower tier of trophy? Because I think, and I don't think the trophy wife is good, because trophy wife as a saying is too narrow, right? Like, a lot of people who wanted the life of a courtesan didn't think of themselves as trophy wives because they didn't just want the traditional trophy wife guy, right? And note here that what I like about the term courtesan is it helps separate between a true housewife and the more modern trad wife, which I think is closer to a courtesan. if you look at the trad wife, right? The trad wife makes everything look pretty, right? She like does at the house. She does in her stupid outfit. She, you know, she does the baking from scratch and everything. And she's doing all that for appearance. She's doing all that to sell both to herself and her husband that he has a certain type of wife. But like, she's not actually managing the family budget, right? Like, she's not actually managing the deeper parts of the family. And many people who society at large would confuse, they would say, well, this woman stays at home and educates the kids as part of her duties. Therefore, she's the same type of thing as this trad woman. And yet one of these women is living the life of a courtesan, where she's sitting around all day, you know, either playing video games or reading, you know, romance novels or whatever. And the other one is working all day long, right? Like,
yeah, these are very different things. And it's very interesting to see how a lot of times traditional conservatives will sell this idea. And this is something that Charlie Kirk had said a lot of times is, guys, if you haven't retired your wives, you should go ahead and work yourself to the bone. There's no reason you should have video games. And I think that's ridiculous. I think that very idea is insane too, because basically he's saying, oh, you should go ahead and change your wife into a courtesan so that she has no worries in the world and she could just sit on her phone all day, you know, browsing through TikTok, rather than going and doing something reasonable to propel the family forward. And I think that's crazy in a lot of ways, and why the sword and shield dynamic works better than this courtesan dynamic, unless you're already substantially wealthy.
For the good of the family, for moving the family's interests forwards. And these are two very different, and note here, because I know some trophy wives and courtesans would be like, well, I am doing it for the family. And I'm like, does the rest of the family care about these social circles you're trying to ingratiate yourself with? And if the answer is no, then you're not doing it for the family. You're doing it for yourself, and you're defining what has value on behalf of the family.
As opposed to back in the day when the women were building out social networks among the wives of other titans of industry, is so they got to be friends with the other wives, so that when the husbands got to meet, they would already be on friendly terms, and the wives could go ahead and help smooth over relationship dynamics so that both families would be made better off in being connected with one another.
Which is obviously, I think, very bad. That's like worse than anything like that, because it's like you're defining the good of the family, and that needs to always be a collective decision. And if you can't convince your husband that what you think is valuable for the family is valuable for the family, yet he's still letting you do it, then you're acting as a courtesan. You are not acting as a wife. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but largely people have lost the plot, and people are very much stuck in their own minds, focused on these. It's not even selfish, because people aren't doing things that would actually make them happy, ironically.
Yeah, they aren't. Courtesans
They're
are
caught in what I guess I could describe as
wives.
Cultural delusions. They're stuck in cultural loops and cultural delusions, and pursuing them to their personal detriment, the detriment of their partner, and the detriment of the relationship. This isn't exclusive to women. It happens to men too. And the most important thing is that when you're looking for a partner, you're looking for someone who shares your objective function. They want to maximize the same thing or cluster.
Hey, Constitution. So that's kind of the purpose of this video, is talking about the roles that were inhabited by traditional wives that were supportive of the endeavors of the husband, and then a traditional courtesan, and what their traditional roles had. And so these roles are being compared and contrasted in this context, so that we can go ahead and take a look side by side. Now, courtesans, another way to look at it from an exclusivity standpoint, is they used to also be called concubines back in the day. So it wasn't just a side piece. It was, he had real responsibilities to her, and the children still had rights of heirship. So kind of a different thing. And so that's why there is a compare and contrast thing going on. Let's go ahead and move to the next comment. But in the era that men had courtesans is when we had the most traditional wives. Now, traditional in what sense, right? So the traditional sense that they're bringing up is the idea between the sword and shield relationship, where the woman would go ahead and handle a lot of the administration of the estate, kind of like we would see in the Proverbs 31 wife, as opposed to what we had with today's trad wives. Now, today's trad wives, he is making a comparison between courtesans and today's trad wives, because a lot of the trad wives will go ahead and just be doing nothing really to support the overall mission of the family. That's why there is the net comparison going on. And then once again, privacy, please. 100%. There's a lot of different types of marriage that go in accordance with the Bible. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Let's continue.
Things that you do, and you both realize that you work well enough together that by combining forces, you will both maximize your objective function, the thing that matters more to you than your own self, more as a team than you will individually. And if that's true, you never have to worry about, so long as you both, continue your pursuit of this objective function, you're never going to fight because you understand that both, your job isn't to just be happy and get what I want. And, every fight isn't about, well, what I want versus what you want. Every disagreement you may ever have is really more like, well, tactically, how are we going to maximize what we both collectively value?
Yes.
And just as an emergent property, you're going to try to make the other person happy and have a good life because you understand, as any.
My recommendation is for men and women to decide what they actually want in life and to orient themselves in that direction. My wife and I, we go ahead and have a sword and shield kind of relationship where I handle business ventures. I'm the one that's pushing the ball down the field to increase our status and increase our wealth. Whereas my wife goes ahead and handles our 4 children, educates them, handles most of the regular provisioning. If there's stuff that I need from a support standpoint, I can go ahead and assign her tasks and duties, and she'll go ahead and take care of them so that I'm freed up to do the higher leverage, higher value tasks that'll go ahead and bring us more wealth overall and bring our family status up substantially. So we are oriented to the same general goals and guidelines, but we work in different capacities because I work according to my strengths and she works according to her strengths. But that is my family dynamic and is not necessarily reflective of what everybody wants to do in their family. So I would say that I would, if you're a man or if you're a woman, start with the end in mind and decide what you want to be and what kind of dynamic you want to have and find somebody that aligns with that. So those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, let's move on.
Good employer does, as any good army general does, that, if your troops, if your team is happy and healthy and thriving, they're going to do a better job. You're not going to get really good work out of someone who's demoralized or sleep deprived or sad or who feels alienated. So just as an emergent problem.
All right. So one real quick thing here is happiness is not the goal. Whereas a lot of people in modern society will have this crazy idea that happiness is what should be the goal rather than the accomplishment of a transcendent cause. That's the big difference, right? So as leader of the family, I go ahead and set the guidance and direction for the family, and she comes on board with my mission. That's how it works in my family. So now it's going to work differently for different families based on your unique dynamic, but it's something that you have to decide as a team, ideally, so that you guys can be on the same sheet of music and have less fights and be more energized to give of yourself to each other. And naturally, you will more likely be more happy and have less fights if you are working for the same objectives. Let's continue.
Are you going to try to be nice to this person? And people in general tend to be nice to other people who share their interests. Plus, there's nothing that gives greater contentment and happiness than knowing that you are doing everything you can within your power to maximize something you value. It takes the FOMO out of life. There is no fear of missing out because you are always doing the very best you can to maximize your basket of values. So there's very little indecision there. Contrast that with the modern Real Housewife or the modern, even just like dink couple. And there's intense levels of FOMO. It's like, oh, well, we decided to max out our credit card and travel to Greece this summer, but should we have gone to Tokyo instead? I don't know. And then they get to Greece and it's so hot and it's really expensive. And then their flight gets canceled, like all these things. And you're wondering, well, could I have been happier if we did this? Is this even what I enjoy? Am I just doing this because I see people doing it on Instagram? Like there's just even if what you want to optimize is happiness, you're not going to find it with that kind of pursuit.
Oh yeah, no, courtesans are never as happy as true wives, right?
No, I disagree. I think that some of the most successful figures in history were courtesans, and
were they happy?
Yeah, but so to be a courtesan is, I think, very different from what people have devolved into now. They had a career. For example, consider Madame Pompadour, who died young and was very much missed. She was extremely intellectual. She influenced policy. She absolutely made the king happy, and she was very good at what she did, and she was very influential. There are definitely people who know what they're good at and they love it, and that was her job was to be smart and attractive and to give pleasure, and she did it well. And that's good. I think you need to understand what your role is in a
But he
relationship.
should die of some venereal
Some disease. It wasn't a venereal disease. I can't remember what it was. Probably some sort of like pox or virus or whatever. People died all the time.
We should do an episode, famous sluts of history.
It wasn't even always sluts. I mean, a lot of the people who ended up as courtesans, didn't necessarily want to be. It just kind of turned out that way. But yeah, I don't think it's about whether you choose courtesan track versus wife track, or as a husband, whether you choose to get a courtesan versus a wife, or a wife and a courtesan. Like a lot of the guys in history had both. You have to understand what your resources can
I
bear.
think also the idea of the courtesan, even for the guy who decides to cheat on his wife or whatever, right? If you contextualize the person you're cheating with as a courtesan, they're always less useful to you than the wife. You're less likely to imagine that they could become a wife because they are not.
This is very true, because if they are not, as you do not have utility to you outside of the pleasure, then that automatically degrades the overall value, because then your youth, your beauty, your ability to bear children are far more valuable to the overall enterprise. And those are things that expire over time, compared to the value of a true wife who is on board with the mission and is fighting alongside you in the sword and shield kind of dynamic. Very important distinction to be made here.
Otherwise, they are only there for your pleasure. They are a human oni hole. They are not actually a thing of value. And
Well, I mean, I've always seen cheating as like a sign of extreme existential doubt, and not really necessarily.
What I mean is, if you look historically, it's very rare for people to leave their wives for their courtesans. That just doesn't happen. But today it happens all the time, where people get confused. And using clearer terminology can prevent that.
That is so true. So if we would go ahead and evolve our use of language to understand the roles that are actually going on, then we would have very clear distinctions about how to look at different circumstances that are ahead of us, instead of being confused about how, in the modern context, a lot of times people are so confused about so many different things because they're unclear on their use of language. Very important things. Let's see. Generation thinking, not happiness, should be a priority. Are there much women that do that nowadays? I would say that that is not something that is common, because a lot of times we have this feminism mind virus that encourages women to seek happiness above everything else. Whereas back in the day when it was really more economic marriage rather than romantic marriage, then there was an understanding on both sides of the equation that you were working for something greater than yourselves, and that you were looking at the perpetuation of your line, and you were looking at something that existed beyond the individual players in that game. Very, very straightforward stuff. And then here we go. Happiness is fleeting. I am constantly telling my friends that chasing happiness is never going to make you happy. However, they are single and divorced and complain that they are unhappy and lonely. Absolutely the case. Happiness is fleeting. Joy, another concept that is closely related, but is a matter of state of being rather than an emotion. Joy is something that can be cultivated over an extended period of time in a much more stable environment than happiness. This is why I go ahead and often talk about on the channel that happy wife, happy life is probably one of the most destructive phrases that has ever been wrought on humanity, because it puts a woman's emotions as sovereign in the relationship, and the guy is constantly trying to be in this hamster wheel to try to please his wife in terms of happiness, and is a moving target all the time, and it will never truly be attainable, because every time an element of happiness is achieved, something will happen and it'll be destroyed, and then you'll have to rebuild it up. And happiness in Let's continue.
I suppose. Yeah.
Also, by the way, side note, in
Yeah.
terms of data we're getting now, we've got 47 users on RFAB in the last 30 minutes.
Nice.
We've got, so it's like, current users. And I turned on the gender thing, which unfortunately I didn't realize how much it sucked on Google. For 97.53%, we can't tell what the gender was.
Oh.
But for the ones we can't tell what the gender was, 1.36 of them were males and 1.1% of them are females. So the male to female ratio is about equal.
That's good. Okay.
And the time on site is about equal too. For males, it's a bit over an hour and 1 minute. And for females, it's 57 minutes and 50 seconds.
Okay. Oh, favorable.
So women use our
Mhm.
site too. And I cleaned up all the scoogy like naked pics and stuff that people had in the top for images, and I was like,
Scoogy is a good word. Thank you for using it.
and I've been preparing for battle.
As one does. As one does.
Got to take out the bad guys before they get to me. I just come like this, and I'm like, I'm just moving the sword like this. If it hits you, it's your fault. That's what I say on the battlefield. Just go like this.
Yeah, is that your move? That's your go-to?
Yeah.
The waggle.
It's
You
just
really
like
do it that way.
the guy comes
Like The
back to me, and
Simpsons.
like I'm just moving in a straight line. If I punch you, it's your own fault.
On my way, I'm gonna be doing this. If you get hit, it's your own fault.
Okay, then I'm gonna start kicking air like this.
Oh god. Well, yeah, I like this concept. I think people need to think really carefully about what they're in it to do. I was horrified when at one point joining a virtual parenting group comprised of very high profile people who just described parenting as like, well, it's just one of those things you do in life. And I'm like, oh my God. Like the number of people who just get married because it's like, well, you know, like I was dating, it's like musical chairs, you know, I was dating them and like I hit my 30s. So then I proposed. Like, what are you doing? This is so weird that people wouldn't.
Yeah, so people act oftentimes without a whole lot of background thought as to why they're doing the things that they're doing. And then they're just like, oh, I just fell into it. As if that's a reasonable way of living your life. Crazy. Let's continue.
Take things like marriage and having kids extremely seriously and understand exactly why they're doing it. And if the answer is, well, I don't know, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, I respect it, I guess. Like, I agree that people overthink things way too much, but also, yikes.
That level of NPC. Well, that level of NPC, I think, is leading to the highest birth rate that we have right now. I mean, these are the people who are going to replace the overthinkers, Simone.
Yeah.
Thinkers who want to have kids are a small group.
U.S. birth rates updated again at new record lows. The biggest drop in terms of age brackets, of course, was teen births. They saw a 7% drop. And a slight decline.
Don't be a pussy.
In births for people in their 20s, and then a slight increase for people in their 30s. So absolutely people are overthinking it or trying to be prepared. I don't think, though, that you need to be a certain age to be capable of understanding why you're doing things. I think you need to understand just who you are and what you're about. And Malcolm, you knew who you were and what you were about.
Oh yeah, I told you exactly what I was about, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
And I mean, like from earlier writings of yours that I've seen, and stories you've told, I don't think you've changed all that much in what you've done. And ultimately, I haven't either. It just happens to be that my personality manifests very differently depending on the resources that I'm given. And I think women are a lot like that in general. That their phenotype will vary significantly depending on the environment. As it were.
Yeah, or the kind of man that they choose to marry. Because a lot of times a woman, generally speaking, will go ahead and manifest a lot of her qualities and characteristics differently depending on the quality of the man that she is settled with, or that she is married, or that she is having babies with. So more often than not, it has a lot to do with the kind of man that she is sleeping with consistently that will change a lot of how she shows herself to be, which is really interesting, scientifically speaking. Let's continue.
I love you very much.
Love you too. And have a spectacular.
Okay, it seems like they're going ahead and closing up. So let's go ahead and get some closing thoughts. All right. So I think that this is really interesting that we've had this conversation about how a lot of times people are very confused about what the traditional lifestyle is, where nowadays we look back to the 1950s as what is traditional. And really, we're tapping into a very short period of history between 1910 and 1970, where you had a one-income household that was generally derived from industry-level labor and could satisfy the needs of an entire household on its own. And this was before we had ubiquitous labor participation in terms of women in our economy directly, whereas we have indirect labor participation of women throughout history, because they were going ahead and doing the farming, they were doing administrative matters, they were watching over the estates if they were members of the aristocracy and things of that nature. These are things that are very different than what we have today. So we would often mistake traditional families with families from the 1910s to the 1970s instead of looking at the traditions that happened before that. And so when we go ahead and look back in history, we realize that for most of human history, women and men were working side by side in different capacities, where men would generally be doing the things that are more risky, but higher risk, higher return, and more in keeping with a skilled trade and things of that nature. Whereas women were often doing farming in pre-plow societies, and they were doing administration, they were doing bureaucracy, they were also educating, they were also doing childcare, they were doing all of these things at the same time. And a lot of times they would do duties and tasks that allowed them to do that and rear children at the same time, whereas men would do the generally more dangerous tasks. So in terms of labor, women were doing hard, grueling labor, like weeding out the fields that were necessary to grow the crops for the entire family and to have extra to sell at market. And a lot of guys are very confused, and a lot of women are kind of confused as to what the traditional lifestyle looks like. And I think that it's worth looking into more. And I think that when we take a look at the sword and shield dynamic that they were talking about for most of this video, I think that this is a very useful way of organizing a marriage, and is, as a Christian myself, this is a very useful way of organizing your family in a way that glorifies God and meets a common goal, so that both the husband and wife can contribute their unique talents, skills, and abilities and move the ball forward and elevate the status of the family and make great things happen. Let's go ahead and take a look at the comments before we wrap up. I'm writing this in my book on Hebrew patriarchy. I've got a whole chapter devoted to women's work. Awesome. Glad to hear it, man. I look forward to seeing what you have to write on the matter. There's a lot of cool things going on in Hebrew patriarchy and things that we can continue on in Christian patriarchy and Christian family formation, generally speaking. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time and view. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe for more. I have several videos that are coming out, 2 videos that are coming out this week. If we go ahead and take a look, let me change up my view and I can give you a brief introduction of what's coming up this week. Let me bring up the screen just to go ahead and show what's up. Let's add to stage. All right. So in videos, things that I have coming up for this week, tomorrow, come on, channel content, let's refresh. I have got providing isn't just about money. Most men get this wrong, where I go ahead and talk about how provisioning has a lot to do with the direction of the family, protection and guidance, and providing leadership to the family. That's something that's going to be released tomorrow. And then on Thursday, I've got a whole video devoted to what the Bible actually says about women and marriage. And for the most part, it's just going to be reading scriptures out of the New King James Version. And so it's a bit of a longer video. It's a little over 10 minutes, but it is pretty much straight scripture for the entire video. So things that I produced last week, we've got You Lost It. This is a video about how men have often lose respect in a relationship and in their marriage when they lose their temper and they fail to control themselves emotionally, and how you can control yourself when the storms of life arise so that you can lead your family well as a man. And so that, and if you are a woman, if you're a housewife in this channel, you can go ahead and see ways of helping to guide your husband to emotional stability so that you can both have a wonderful, long-lasting relationship and marriage together. And then the other one from last week is a video about how most men are alone in terms of male friendships and brotherhood. And because they don't have adequate relationships around them and good, solid friendships, they often are at a disadvantage as a whole in society. Because if you don't have a group of friends to bounce ideas off of, then you are at a disadvantage because you don't get additional people taking a look and seeing what you're doing and helping you to adjust to be better over time. And these are things that are incredibly important in a man's life. And so why it's important, if you are a wife, to encourage your husband to spend time with his friends and not to try to take his friends from him when you first get married, because that is probably one of the most deleterious things that you could do to your marriage, taking good men out of your husband's life. So these are things that I had put out over the last week and things to look forward to. Thank you so much for taking the time to view. If you like what you see, go ahead and hit the like button and hit subscribe and tune in for more. I'll go ahead and be back on Saturday for another stream. Thank you so much for what you do. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.